the Iranian blockade of the Straits of Hormuz is causing extraordinary economic problems, which are impacting globally. And in fact, a number of countries that are not active players in this war are being hit the hardest. You could say that all of Europe, Japan, China, South Korea are feeling the largest immediate impact.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Heroes Path podcast. I'm Colonel John Fenslow. 2 weeks ago, Jeff Steinberg and I sat down to talk about Iran, the Poly crisis, the Suez parallel, the ceasefire and how that was fragile. We talked about the Islamabad talks, and the deadline for that was April 22nd. So we told you that the next decision point was coming fast. And so here we are 2 weeks later. I was just in Europe, so we weren't able to do this last week. But that deadline has come and gone. The ceasefire was extended. Then Iran seized 2 ships within hours of that extension. And the United States and Iran began blockading one another. Oil hit $126 a barrel. The April CPI is going to be ugly. And as of today, May 1st, the 60-day war powers deadline expires with Congress in recess, and the president's saying that we might need to renew the war. So Jeff is back with me to talk about what changed, what it means, and what to watch in the coming days. Jeff, thanks very much for joining us once again.
John, it's great to be here. And as you said, things have been changing at breakneck speed. But I think basically we're at a point right now where both the U.S. and the Iranian side have come to separate but compatible conclusions that resumption of the heavy combat of the first 3 or so weeks of this war is not in the best interests of either country. And so President Trump has basically extended the ceasefire indefinitely and has made a number of comments suggesting that there's a good deal of back and forth diplomatically between the United States and Iran, mediated through Pakistan, through Oman, and others. And I think the underlying issue is that right now, the U.S. blockade is probably doing more measurable damage to Iran from the economic standpoint than the bombing campaigns. There's an estimate from a very prominent and very qualified Israeli military analyst that the blockade is costing Iran about $13 billion a month in lost revenue, in inflation, and in a certain sense, one of the driving figures behind this new shift to an economic phase in warfare within the Trump administration is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's been talking about basically an economic escalation that's having a greater impact on Iran than the bombing campaign was.
There's quite an irony in there, isn't it, that we launch a war and what has the most effect is the economic dimension of it all.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the Trump administration has maintained a maximum pressure campaign from the time that the president withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. But this is a very substantial escalation. There are holes in the blockade. If the Iranians are to be believed, they're basically conducting a kind of flood the zone strategy of deploying multiple ships at one point, knowing that the blockade is not total and that there are vulnerabilities if you can rush it. And the Iranians are claiming that about half of the ships are getting out or coming in successfully, bypassing. But the Iranian blockade of the Straits of Hormuz is causing extraordinary economic problems, which are impacting globally. And in fact, a number of countries that are not active players in this war are being hit the hardest. You could say that all of Europe, Japan, China, South Korea are feeling the largest immediate impact in terms of what you just cited, $126 a barrel oil prices, and actual prices for delivery, real-time delivery in Asia are about $20 a barrel higher than that. Also, there's more than just oil and gas that transits the straits. There is now a global crisis of shortages of fertilizer, which has already impacted the spring plantings in many parts of the world. And so there's projections that no matter what happens now, there are going to be food production declines and food shortages in many parts of the world comes the fall to early winter of this year. In fact, many component parts for high technology manufacturing also pass through the straits, including some of the components, the metals and other things that are required for the semiconductor industry. So the broader consequences are great, and it's putting increased political pressure on President Trump as well.
And it's interesting too, Jeff, as you talk about this, because I think that one of the Iranian advisors just posted publicly that the losing side cannot dictate the terms. And so, that phrase, the losing side can't dictate the terms, is coming from the Iranians, not from the United States. What's the message there?
Both sides are giving the same message. Both sides looking for ways in which they can claim victory. Trump, from the standpoint of the damage, the real measurable damage to the Iranians' military capability, which is not the 95 to 98% that Hegseth talks about, but Pentagon estimates are that Iran retains about 60% of its drones and about 60% of its attack ships and about 40+% of their missiles. And of course, the IAEA confirms that it's their understanding that those 440 kilos of higher enriched uranium are still buried underground at one of their major facilities. And both sides are trying to essentially conduct a narrative indicating victory in order to maintain an option of withdrawing from the war as victors. The Iranian side seems to be going through certain internal disputes between a more pragmatic faction and a more radically hardline faction over whether to negotiate or whether to just stand their ground and actually move forward towards the development of a nuclear weapon capability. So there's internal disputes on the Iranian side. The head of the IRGC has recently been critical of the foreign minister Araghchi, who seems to have the support of President Putin and also the Speaker of the Parliament, who's also part of the negotiating team and is a former Air Force commander of the IRGC. So there's no question there's factional splits there, just as there are emerging splits in the U.S. over the fact that we're right at that 60-day point where the War Powers Resolution kicks in. And so there is a kind of political fallout process that's natural in the midst of this kind of a war. Israel is in turmoil over the fact that the war that's underway in southern Lebanon is not going as smoothly from the Israeli standpoint as they hope. And Hezbollah's demonstrated that they've got longer range missile capability so that even if they're forced north of the Litani River and Israel retains that occupation buffer zone, any Israeli forces in the buffer zone are dangerously facing attack. And the same is true for the settlements in northern Israel that have been essentially forced to be evacuated or are under constant air raid warnings about incoming Hezbollah attacks.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Jeff, let me go back real quick to something you just mentioned, and that is, I think it's one of the most consequential developments over the last 2 weeks. On just a couple of days ago, April 29th, the IAEA director told the AP that Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and you're talking about roughly 972 pounds of this, 440 kilograms, is believed to still be there. And that's not something that's speculated. It's something that the community, there's broad consensus on. Even the Iranians have said that it's still there. So what does that tell us? And I also think that it links to another development, and that is this whole deployment of the Dark Eagle hypersonic missiles, which I think we really have to look at, and that just increases how consequential that fact is right now.
Yeah, I think all of those points are absolutely correct. The general view, And this even reflected in the global threat assessments that are produced collectively by the U.S. intelligence community every year, has been that Iran's capability for building a nuclear weapon is present because of the knowledge that exists among a fairly large scientific community inside Iran. Remember, nuclear weapons technology is 80 years old, and it's not the most advanced science, and the Iranians clearly have people who know how to do it, but that under the late Ayatollah Supreme Leader Khamenei, there had been basically an edict, a fatwa, against moving to actually building a nuclear weapon. He's dead, and there's no clear indication that his son, his successor, has retained that. So there's clearly factions inside Iran that say, look, the only government that doesn't seem to be under continuing threat of regime change is North Korea, because they've demonstrated that they have a nuclear weapons capability, and it seems to be a pretty viable deterrent against regime change. So there's factions in Iran that want that. And so the 440 kilos is something that the Iranians seem to be willing to negotiate. One option that at least some reporting indicated that they were open to reducing the potency down to 5 or 10%, which would be necessary for maintaining their commercial nuclear reactor, and they want to build another one, but would not be weapons grade. The other option, the Russians have indicated a willingness to basically store it, again, reduce its lethality. So the real Iranian capability lies in the centrifuge knowledge that they have and the scientific establishment that really has the skill set to move forward if there was a top-down order to go to build a bomb. And that remains a factor. The Israeli
do you think that there's any room for a deal there? Because in some respects, it looks like everything's kind of mutually exclusive. Iran's offer is defer the nuclear talks indefinitely, and they're saying that any kind of IAEA access is conditional on a deal. And meanwhile, the U.S. is saying that we're not talking about a 5-year halt on enrichment. We're talking about 20 years. So I'm just wondering if you think that if that gap is at all bridgeable in the long run.
I suspect it is, if the larger view of the both sides concluding that things like the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz from the U.S. side and the blockade from the Iranian side is doing so much economic damage and is causing so much other collateral diplomatic damage that some middle ground has to be found. And the Iranians have people who are veterans of the original JCPOA negotiations that took years to finalize. Arakchi, the foreign minister, was integral in those talks. And so they know that if you even reach an agreement in principle that we're going to work it out, that the workout at the technical level is going to take a lot of fine-tuned work. The U.S. sent some of those people to the Islamabad talk with Vance, but clearly the moment wasn't right yet for those kinds of technical talks to take place. But I do not rule it out that we reach a point maybe sooner than later where the exhaustion factor and the collateral damage, the economic impact on both sides makes it necessary to where either you go all in or you reach a deal.
Yeah.
And at that moment, there's always a deal to be had.
But here we are today, it's May 1st, but it's really not any normal Friday, because under the War Powers Resolution, which was signed in 1973, a president has 60 days from notifying Congress of hostilities to either secure congressional authorization or terminate all military activities. And President Trump notified Congress on March 2nd. Today, therefore, the clock runs out. But oh, by the way, you've got Congress that's going in recess today as well. There's a lot of things that are happening right here, but it's pretty foundational to this democracy if you really look at it in a hard way, because it's probably a little bit worrisome that this is becoming a partisan issue as well, because the Speaker of the House, Johnson, has previously called the War Powers Act unconstitutional. You've got the Secretary of War who is saying that it doesn't apply because we're in the midst of a ceasefire. But oh, by the way, you've got Senators Murkowski, Tillis, Collins, and others saying that they're not going to support anything and that they're actually going to institute litigation if they don't comply. So where does that leave us?
I think where it leaves us is that for people in Congress, the 60-day deadline is a pretty important issue. It's really a test of whether the Congress still has the will to fulfill its constitutional responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so we have the immediate issue of the War Powers Resolution. And really, it's a test of a larger issue of whether or not the majority party is going to be simply a rubber stamp for the president. And I think that this is one of the reasons why is trying to come up with an argument that basically says the clock stopped and we're really not at 60 days, but we're at about 45 days or 40 days from the standpoint that the ceasefire went into effect. How that is interpreted is something that,
Jeff, it seems to me that might be a vacuous argument, don't you?
I agree completely. But then again, the question is, does that give Republicans in the House and Senate the wiggle room to say, okay, we accept that and we're resetting the clock? All of these issues, you're absolutely right, are on the table, and Congress has taken the opportunity to leave town and defer having to make a decision. I think right now on the Senate side, there's probably enough votes that are going to shift. Collins is one of the shifts already. The vote that took place just prior to the 60-day point was still 47 to 53. So we're talking about basically 4 additional Republicans switching sides. And I think that probably the White House and the Senate Majority Leader and others know that is where things stand on the Senate side.
Yeah.
So again, you're right. It's another issue that is coming up and is going to have to be resolved very quickly.
Yeah, and if it's litigated, it's going to be going to the Supreme Court, isn't it?
That's right. And of course, whether the Supreme Court accepts it on an accelerated docket and tries to deal with it, even as one of those issues that they handle on the emergency docket, or whether they wait it out and leave it until after the war is over, whenever that may be. These are all, issues that are playing out against the backdrop of the economic crisis that you've identified. And the fact that everybody's now looking towards November. Every day that passes is closer to the November congressional elections. And even though the Supreme Court issued a ruling the other day that may shift as many as 19 House seats, the directionality still appears to be going in favor of a Democratic majority, at least in the House after November.
Let's look at the numbers also that really matter to all of our households. Oil. We had talked a little bit about this, but Brent crude closed today at $111. Just a couple days ago on April 29th, you had already mentioned it closed at 126 intraday. Right. And so that's a 4-year wartime high. And then you talk about gasoline, and that's what really matters to all of us. The average cost of gasoline right now is at about $4 a gallon. And that's the first time that gas has crossed $4 nationally. We've seen it at $4 before in certain parts of the country.
California, sure.
But when speaking of California, gas is at $5.89.
Yeah, exactly.
And then diesel, I've got a diesel that just crossed over $6 in many states. Yeah. Arizona, Florida, that saw a 37% year-over-year increase. And then you can get inflation too. Sure. I think that we're also seeing inflation going way up too, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. It's projected this month at 3.5%, way above that Fed 2% figure. I think the other element of all of this that needs to be mentioned is that there's been now a series of studies that have come out just in the past week since our last discussion. A major report by the American Enterprise Institute, supplemental research by both NBC and CBS, indicating, number one, that the depletion level of critical weapon systems, the Patriot and THAAD intercepts, other basically airborne cruise missiles, long-range cruise missiles, have been tremendously depleted The
Mhm.
projections are that under current production levels, it will take 6 years to be able to replenish what was used up in really the first 2 weeks of the war. And stockpiles have been moved from South Korea and other places in order to plug some of that gap. The Pentagon has asked for a $1.5 trillion budget for fiscal year 27. That's the Trump request, with $350 billion allocated to invest in expanded production capability to begin addressing the fact that there's no surge capacity. That's going to mean further austerity because that $350 billion requires offsets from non-military parts of the fiscal year 27 budget. So we're looking at consequences that extend significantly beyond just the immediate inflation figures and the gas prices and things like that. Today, I took note that Spirit Airlines is shutting down altogether because they couldn't reach a bailout deal. And of course, part of that is the fact that the increase in the price of jet fuel is probably higher percentage-wise than diesel or regular unleaded gasoline. So the consequences of this all around from the economic domain are really starting to bite, and that's going to have political consequences as well. So again, I think that this pause is as much a reflection of the fact that both the Iranian side and the U.S. and broader global Western economies side are taking a pretty significant cumulative hit on this.
Yeah. Jeff, let me ask you, what do you think that our listeners should be watching over the next 2 weeks, if you were to pick just the top two or three?
Number one, whether we see some sort of a resolution of the policy dispute inside Iran and they can come up with a position that is both acceptable to all factions and is pragmatic enough to be able to actually move towards a deal, and how much flexibility the Trump administration is going to basically give in those negotiations. I think that's one critical issue. Secondly, the larger question of the political and economic dynamics as the impact really sinks in deeper. 2 weeks ago, the IMF spring meeting warned that the war continuing meant global recession. And I think that the word depression is not part of the IMF vocabulary. So you can take that a couple of steps further.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I think there's indications that Trump has lost his patience with Netanyahu, and the pressure on Israel to extend the ceasefire in Lebanon, which is something that Netanyahu is extremely unhappy about, is a reflection that they're getting clear indications that the overenthusiasm on the part of the Israelis, especially the Mossad chief, for regime change as a quick fix on the Iran situation did not materialize. And now, essentially, Trump is stuck looking for a way out of a quagmire that American intelligence was warning about from day one. But he went with the Israelis because of the compelling argument that the Mossad made was that we know better. We're on the ground. We have capabilities in Iran that you guys can't even imagine, and we're not going to tell you about them, but we have the Wunderwaffens to bring the regime down. So those are the three things that I would say are worth keeping a close watch on in a still very unpredictable situation.
And there's other things that are on the horizon as well. It's May 1st today. May 11th is when the Senate returns, and that's when you're going to be hearing more about from Congress whether it's going to reassert itself or not. And then the day after that, April CPI data comes out. So that's the first full month of war pricing, and that's what the Fed's going to be looking at. And oh, by the way, that's also what your grocery bill is going to be reading as well. And
Yeah.
And then just a couple of days after that, you've got the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing. And China has, I think right now, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, about 140-day strategic oil reserve. And now they're weighing aggressively to support Iran. So the leverage in this entire situation may be sitting outside the Middle East and towards Beijing as well, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. On the other hand, both the United States and China know that they need each other. Basically, in the Cold War, we talked about mutually assured destruction in terms of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
With US and China, it's mutually assured destruction in terms of the economic integration.
Yeah.
And over the last 24 hours, there's been high-level diplomacy between the US and China. Rubio and Wang Yi began discussing details of the summit agenda, and Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade rep, had a lengthy conversation with the deputy premier of China on the economic agenda for the summit. And there's clear indication that both sides know that they need to preserve those trade ties, even though the evidence continues that China's playing a major role in propping up Iran's ability to sustain the fighting. And of course, we haven't even discussed the fact that Russia historically has had the closest ties to the IRGC and presumably is playing a significant role. And, the reports that have come out in the last few days are that the U.S. bases throughout the Middle East suffered far more damage than had been announced publicly. Estimates are that 11 bases in 7 countries took significant hits, and just the damage to the physical locations, the sites, was over $5 billion, and also raises the question about whether there's an ability to secure large fixed location bases in the Middle East anymore. So these are all large considerations, but I think U.S.-China is right at the top of my list in terms of how this situation moves forward.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, to our listeners, we closed with a phrase that the pause will end. It always does. And that pause technically continues, but every other meaningful indicator, whether it's oil prices, mortgage rates, naval engagements, ship seizures, and now we're talking about hypersonic missile deployments, the constitutional standoff that we are going to be potentially seeing here over the next couple of weeks. And then we've got just 4% of normal traffic going through the Straits of Hormuz. That's all telling us something, that pause is functional really in name only. And the decisions to our listeners that you can make are still the same. You need to understand what your energy exposure is today, not the prices from February, and then also to resist the simple narrative. Don't confuse the absence of formal warfare with the absence of war's effects on your life. And that includes things like your mortgage rates, your grocery bills, your gas bills. They're all going to be sitting in the April CPI numbers that are going to be coming out in less than 2 weeks. So Jeff Steinberg, thanks very much for helping us see the big pattern, not just the event. It's always great to have you with us.
Likewise, John, I look forward to next week, and maybe we'll start seeing some closure.
I sure hope so. My diesel 1994 G-Wagon needs that. So to our listeners, stay informed, stay grounded, and stay curious. This is Colonel John Fenzel. Thanks very much for listening to the Heroes Path podcast, and we'll see you next week.